Did you know nearly 9 out of 10 people in China hold an unfavorable view of Japan? Or that the US bombing of the Chinese embassy in 1999 is still remembered in schools as proof of foreign hostility? To understand China's foreign policy, you have to understand its biggest beefs, the countries and territories where history, pride, and politics collide. These aren't just old grudges. They shape trade, diplomacy, and even the possibility of war. Today, we're breaking down all of them. Before we dive into each country, let's set the stage. For more than 100 years, from the Opium Wars in 1839 to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, China was invaded, divided, and exploited by foreign powers. Britain, France, Russia, and especially Japan carved away pieces of the country. In the 1930s and 40s, Japanese occupation killed millions of Chinese civilians. In China, this period is remembered as the century of humiliation. Schools, museums, and media constantly reinforce the message, never again. That national memory shapes how ordinary Chinese people view other countries today. Section 1. China versus Japan. China's most emotional and long-lasting beef is with Japan. The roots lie in the 1930s and 40s. Japan's invasion brought atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, and Unit 731's experiments on human beings. This trauma is retold constantly in Chinese education and media. For many Chinese, the war isn't distant history. It's a wound passed down through generations. But the anger isn't just about history. It's also about what many Chinese see as Japan's failure to truly apologize. When Japanese leaders visit the Yasukuni Shrine, where convicted war criminals are honored, it sparks outrage across China. Surveys show only about 10% of Chinese people believe Japan has apologized sufficiently for its actions during World War II. That leaves a massive perception gap that keeps resentment alive. On top of this history is a modern territorial dispute over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. When Japan's government moved to nationalize some of the islands in 2012, massive anti-Japan protests erupted across China. And more recently, Japan's decision to release treated wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plant fueled new waves of anger, with many Chinese convinced it was unsafe despite scientific evidence. Public opinion has been consistently negative. Travel and cultural exchange sometimes soften attitudes, but overall, Japan remains the most disliked country among Chinese citizens. Section 2. China versus the United States. If Japan represents old wounds, the United States is the rival of today. The first major clash was the Korean War in the 1950s, where Chinese troops fought US forces to defend North Korea. For older generations, this cemented the view of America as an imperialist aggressor. During the Cold War, the US supported Taiwan, refused to recognize Beijing's government, and later criticized China for human rights abuses after the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989. These tensions fed a narrative that the US wants to undermine China's communist system. A turning point was 1999, when US-led NATO bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Yugoslavia conflict. The US said it was an accident. Almost no one in China believed that. It was seen as deliberate, and the anger poured into the streets. The embassy bombing is still remembered today as proof that America is hostile to China. In recent years, rivalry has only deepened. The trade war tech bans on Huawei and TikTok, US Navy patrols in the South China Sea, and most of all arms sales and political support for Taiwan reinforce the idea that Washington is trying to contain China's rise. Surveys show 3 out of 4 Chinese now have negative views of the US. Many make a distinction between American culture and American policy. Some admire US movies, universities, and lifestyle. But when it comes to politics, the US is seen as China's biggest obstacle. Section 3. China versus Taiwan. Taiwan is the most sensitive of all. From Beijing's perspective, it isn't even a foreign country. It's unfinished business from the Chinese Civil War. In 1949, the defeated nationalist government fled to Taiwan and set up the Republic of China. Ever since, the Communist Party has insisted Taiwan is a Chinese province, destined one day to be reunified. For mainland Chinese, this is about national pride and unity. Maps, textbooks, and TV shows all reinforce the idea that Taiwan is part of China. Support for independence in Taiwan is seen as betrayal, and any foreign country supporting Taiwan is viewed as interfering in China's family matters. Most Chinese say they prefer peaceful reunification, but they also say independence is unacceptable and war would be justified if Taiwan tried to break away formally. This explains why Chinese public opinion explodes whenever Taiwan elects a pro-independence leader or when US officials visit Taipei. Even people who criticize their own government on other issues almost always rally around Beijing's position on Taiwan. It's the ultimate red line. Section 4. China versus India. China and India don't share the same historical trauma as Japan or the US, but they do have a tense border rivalry. In 1962, the two countries fought a brief war in the Himalayas. China won, but the dispute never disappeared. The border remains contested in two regions, Aksai Chin, which China controls but India claims, and Arunachal Pradesh, which India controls but China calls South Tibet. In 2020, tensions boiled over again in the Galwan Valley. Soldiers from both sides fought with sticks and stones in a deadly clash that left dozens dead. This shocked both countries and hardened nationalist feelings. In China, the soldiers who died were honored as martyrs, and public opinion turned more hostile toward India. Chinese media often portray India as a developing country trying to punch above its weight, sometimes encouraged by the United States. The fact that India is part of the Quad security group with the US, Japan, and Australia makes many Chinese believe India is lining up against them. While there's less emotional hatred here compared to Japan, nationalism means most Chinese strongly oppose giving up territory and support standing firm, even at the risk of conflict. Section 5. China versus South Korea. Relations with South Korea are more complicated. On the one hand, many Chinese people love K-pop, K-dramas, and Korean fashion. On the other hand, political disputes can quickly sour that goodwill. The biggest flashpoint came in 2017, when South Korea agreed to host the US THAAD missile defense system. Beijing saw it as a threat to its own security. In response, China organized boycotts of South Korean businesses, restricted tourism, and blocked K-pop concerts and TV shows. Public opinion shifted sharply negative, with many feeling South Korea had betrayed China by siding with the US beyond security. Cultural disputes sometimes flare. Arguments over whether kimchi is originally Korean or Chinese, or over who can claim ancient kingdoms like Goguryeo, have caused angry exchanges online. Even clothing became controversial when a hanbok was worn in the Beijing Winter Olympics opening ceremony. These cultural spats may sound small, but they tap into nationalist pride on both sides. Overall, Chinese views of South Korea are mixed. Admiration for its culture and economy, but suspicion of its US alliance and frustration when politics interfere. Section 6. China versus Vietnam and the Philippines. With Vietnam, China has a long and tangled relationship. During the Vietnam War, China supported the Vietnamese communists against the US. But by 1979, the two countries fought a short, bloody border war after Vietnam invaded Cambodia. China called it a lesson, but both sides suffered. The memory lingers, even if it's downplayed officially. Today, the main source of tension is the South China Sea. Both Vietnam and the Philippines claim islands and reefs that China insists are its own. China has built military outposts on some reefs, while Vietnam and the Philippines have held onto others. When China parked a giant oil rig in contested waters in 2014, it sparked riots in Vietnam that killed Chinese workers. Chinese opinion hardened, seeing Vietnam as ungrateful and aggressive. The Philippines has clashed with China repeatedly over fishing rights and reefs like Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal. In 2016, the Philippines won a legal case in The Hague that rejected China's sweeping claims. China dismissed it, and many Chinese saw it as another example of foreigners ganging up on them. When Chinese Coast Guard ships fire water cannons at Philippine boats, Chinese media frame it as law enforcement in Chinese waters. Nationalist netizens often mock the Philippines as relying on US backing. In both cases, public opinion is strongly hawkish. Over 80% of Chinese believe Vietnam and the Philippines should stop objecting and accept China's sovereignty in the South China Sea, no matter what international law says. Section 7. Beijing's domestic beefs. Territories that resist. China's tensions aren't only with foreign countries. Beijing also faces independence or autonomy movements within areas it considers domestic. Taiwan is the biggest, but there are others. Tibet has long had a strong cultural identity centered around the Dalai Lama, who lives in exile. Many Tibetans want more autonomy, but in China, the government frames Tibet as having been liberated and modernized. Most Chinese see separatism there as illegitimate, even treacherous. Xinjiang, home to the Uyghur Muslim minority, is another flashpoint. Exile groups call it East Turkestan and seek independence. Inside China, however, the narrative is about terrorism and extremism. Harsh security policies are widely supported by the public, who see them as necessary for stability. Hong Kong, once seen as a model under one country, two systems, became a target of nationalist anger after the 2019 protests. Mainland Chinese overwhelmingly supported the crackdown and the national security law, framing the protests as chaos stoked by foreign interference. In contrast, Macau is held up as a good example of smooth integration with little political drama. Inner Mongolia sees smaller-scale disputes, usually over language policies in schools. It doesn't stir as much emotion nationwide, but when it does, Chinese netizens generally support government control. And finally, the South China Sea itself is seen as an inalienable part of China. School textbooks, maps, and patriotic education all reinforce the idea that these waters belong to China since ancient times. Challenges from neighbors are dismissed as illegitimate. Overview. These aren't just border disputes or diplomatic spats. They're deeply emotional issues for China's people rooted in history and pride. For outsiders, it's easy to call it nationalism. But for many Chinese, it's about dignity and making sure the century of humiliation never repeats. The question is, can these wounds ever heal, or will they define the 21st century? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe for more Global Explainers.